The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electronic song above the oncology ward at Sacred Heart in Houston, a sound that had become as familiar to Brooke Sullivan as her own heartbeat. 2 years. 24 months of deliberate invisibility, of choosing the quietest corner of the hospital and making it smaller still. The antiseptic smell, that sharp chemical bite of bleach and something clinical she could never quite name, had become her air now, replacing the desert dust that still visited her at 3 a.m. She kept a dying succulent on her desk. One of those impossible plants that required almost nothing and still managed to fade anyway. Next to it sat a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a gift from someone whose name she no longer let herself remember. The third item on her small desk corner was a photograph, one she turned face down whenever footsteps approached. Muscle memory, that habit. The kind of thing you did without thinking, the way soldiers learned to scan exits in public buildings or kept their backs to walls. Brooke had spent her entire nursing shift that morning moving through the oncology ward like a ghost with a stethoscope. Vitals checked. Charts updated. Pain medications administered in precise measured doses. She spoke only when necessary, using words like token she had to spend carefully. Blood pressure's up slightly. The morphine should help with that. I'll bring extra blankets. Her voice had become something thin and careful, a sound that belonged to someone with nothing worth saying. The other nurses had stopped trying to include her in their break room conversations around month 6 of her tenure at Sacred Heart. She didn't blame them. She'd been polite but distant, always finding a reason to leave when they sat down, always choosing the supply closet over the staff room. Isolation was a choice she'd made consciously, the way a soldier picks a defensive position. Better alone than explaining why she sometimes went rigid at loud noises. Better alone than having to look someone in the eye while lying about where she'd been for the past decade. Dr. Harrison Hargrove ruled the oncology unit the way men of his particular privilege often ruled, with a voice that expected obedience and a network of hospital board connections that made him essentially untouchable. He was 53, carried himself like someone who'd never once questioned whether the world would bend to his preference, and had eyes that scanned people the way a predator scans a field, looking for weakness. He'd noticed Brooke on her 3rd day at the hospital, had watched her settle into her corner, and had dismissed her as precisely what she appeared to be, a competent but unremarkable nurse, the kind who would never challenge him, never draw attention, never matter. That assessment was convenient for him. It was also dead wrong. She'd been changing a post-operative dressing on Mrs. Chen, a pancreatic cancer patient in room for 12, when Hargrove had stopped by the bedside 2 weeks ago. Brooke's hands moved with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory built over thousands of hours, steady, precise, economical in movement. No wasted motion. No hesitation. She had the dressing changed and Mrs. Chen's pain managed in less than 4 minutes. Hargrove had watched her work, his expression shifting from indifference to something like suspicion, and then he'd walked out without comment. He had not asked her to explain her technique. He had not asked where she'd learned to move her hands like someone who'd done this under pressure before. He had simply dismissed it as overeager nursing school behavior, the kind of thing you corrected in staff meetings. The morning the mute veteran arrived at Sacred Heart, the temperature in the unit seemed to drop 10 degrees without warning. His name was in the admission file as Marcus Webb, age 58, brought in by ambulance from a VA clinic in southeast Houston after complaining of chest pain and difficulty breathing. The initial assessment suggested pneumonia, maybe some fluid buildup. Nothing that couldn't be managed with antibiotics and rest. What the intake nurse had missed, or what the overworked ER resident had failed to document clearly, was the dense scarring across his left side, the kind of scarring that only came from explosive trauma. Shrapnel wounds. Old ones, maybe 20 years old, maybe older. The kind that left their mark on everything they touched. He was pale when they brought him in, his breathing shallow and rapid, his fingers clutching at the blanket like it might somehow anchor him to something solid. He couldn't speak. Brooke learned this from his daughter, who arrived 15 minutes after he did, her voice tight with the particular kind of worry that came from loving someone who'd been broken by war and never quite healed. Marcus had lost his voice to an IED in Fallujah in 2004. The daughter was named Sarah, and she had eyes the color of storm-dark seas, and she looked at her father the way people looked at people they'd already nearly lost once. Brooke was reviewing his chart when something in her recognition system triggered. 2 separate alarms, operating on 2 different frequencies. The official medical alarm, his chest X-ray, showed an opacity on the left side that suggested fluid, maybe infection, maybe something worse. The other alarm, the one she never let show on her face, came from somewhere deeper. From the part of her that had spent 6 years reading survival in the field and learning how bodies responded when they were breaking down from the inside. She pulled the chest X-ray up on the bedside computer and studied it while Hargrove stood at the nursing station, reviewing charts with the kind of distracted attention that suggested he'd already determined this case was routine. The opacity bothered her. Not the location, that was consistent with what they'd expect from an old shrapnel wound. It was the shape, the density, the way it seemed to extend into the tissues around what should have been scar tissue. Brooke had seen a lot of things in Baghdad. She'd seen what happened to arteries when shrapnel tore through them and the body attempted to heal itself without proper surgical intervention. She'd seen the delayed complications that emerged years later when old wounds finally gave way. She'd seen the human body perform miracles and catastrophes with equal efficiency, sometimes simultaneously. When she examined Marcus Webb at 11:08 a.m. that morning, her hands didn't tremble. They moved with the kind of automatic precision that came from training so deep it lived in your fingers rather than your conscious mind. She checked his lungs, clear, surprisingly, the breath sounds normal. She palpated his left side, feeling for heat, for swelling, for the subtle signs that told her what the X-ray had only begun to suggest. When she found it, a subtle fullness beneath the old scarring, a tension in the tissues that shouldn't have been there, she went still for exactly 2 seconds. Then she excused herself, told Sarah she needed to get the doctor, and walked to the nurse's station where Dr. Hargrove was reviewing lab work with the kind of casual certainty that suggested he'd already moved on from this patient mentally. "Doctor. Room for 12. Her voice was deferential, carefully structured to apologize for bothering him. "I think you should examine him again." Hargrove glanced up, his expression suggesting he'd been interrupted during something far more important. "The chest X-ray's consistent with the clinical picture, Brooke. Pneumonia, maybe some pleural effusion. We'll start antibiotics and the scarring pattern suggests prior arterial compromise." She kept her voice level, her word choice precise. "That could mean current vascular involvement. I think his pain location and his respiratory distress pattern warrant a closer examination." For just a moment, something flickered in Hargrove's eyes. It wasn't agreement. It was something closer to annoyance at being questioned by someone whose opinion he'd already decided didn't matter. He stood up, exhaled with the theatrical heaviness of a man being asked to do something beneath him, and walked back to room 412. Brooke followed, her hand steady at her sides. The examination took 3 minutes. Hargrove listened to his lungs, looked at the X-ray again, and had already turned to leave when Brooke said quietly, "The left anterior," indicating the specific location where she'd found the tension. Hargrove's hand returned to that spot, and this time something in his posture changed. The tension she'd identified was real. The tissues were warm. And beneath it all, there was something else, the subtle but unmistakable sign of compromise in the structures beneath the skin. "Get a CT angiogram." "Now," Hargrove said, his tone already shifting into the particular authority that came when a doctor finally recognized they might have missed something. "I want vascular on consult immediately." But Brooke was already moving. The second she'd identified the vascular involvement, something in her had shifted into a different operating system. She had the 4 placed in Marcus's right arm in 40 seconds flat, an 18-gauge needle, smooth and efficient, the kind of placement that would handle rapid fluid administration if it became necessary. Her movements had changed. They'd become faster, more precise, the kind of movements that didn't come from civilian nursing training but from something older and deeper. An older medic, some kind of visiting specialist from the VA clinic, standing in the doorway observing, went absolutely rigid. She felt him staring. Felt the moment of recognition wash across the room like a pressure change before a storm. The pattern of her work. The way she positioned the patient. the specific angle of the needle insertion, the angle most useful in austere settings with limited lighting, and a countdown timer on how long you had before catastrophic blood loss ended everything. That was a pattern taught in exactly one place. To exactly one kind of person. And it was classified in ways that meant she should never, under any circumstances, be using it in a civilian hospital while wearing a name badge that read, Brooke Sullivan, RN. The CT angiogram came back 20 minutes later. The radiologist's voice on the phone carried the particular tension of someone delivering news they knew would change the treatment plan entirely. There's a pseudoaneurysm. The radiologist's words came rapid fire, clinical precision overlaying genuine concern. Left anterior intercostal region looks like it's eroding into the pleural space. This patient needs vascular surgery immediately. If that thing ruptures, he'll exsanguinate in minutes. A pseudoaneurysm. An artery that had been torn, had begun to heal, and had now decided 20 years later to start bleeding into the space around it. The kind of complication that was both obvious in hindsight and completely catastrophic in real time. The kind of thing that killed people if it wasn't managed with absolute precision. Marcus needed to go to the OR. Vascular surgery would handle it. That was the protocol. That was the standard of care. That was what should have happened. Except vascular surgery was currently in the middle of a 7-hour abdominal reconstruction 3 floors up, and the on-call vascular attending was at least 30 minutes out. Marcus's respiratory rate was climbing. His oxygen saturation was beginning to drift downward, 94%, 93%, trending the wrong direction. The pseudoaneurysm was pressing into his pleural space, making it harder for his lungs to expand, putting pressure on structures that were never meant to handle pressure. He had a window. Maybe an hour. Maybe less. Brooke was at the bedside reviewing his labs when Hargrove made the decision to move him to pre-op and wait for the vascular surgeon. It was the right call by every protocol, every standard of care guideline, every measure of institutional accountability. It was also the decision of a man who didn't understand what he was looking at, who'd seen the problem but hadn't really felt the urgency the way someone who'd treated arterial wounds in austere conditions under fire could feel it. The pseudoaneurysm was enlarging. The pressure was building. Time was compressing. Marcus was being transferred to the pre-op holding area when something shifted in the monitoring readout. His O2 sat dropped to 91%. His breathing became more labored. His daughter Sarah grabbed Brooke's hand, her eyes wide with the particular kind of fear that came from watching someone you loved begin to fail in real time. Brooke looked at Hargrove. Looked at the patient. Looked at the clock on the wall that read 1:37 p.m. And made a choice that would echo through the next 72 hours in ways no one in that moment could have predicted. She walked into the procedure room where they were prepping Marcus for transfer, and she did something that no civilian nurse should have known how to do. She prepared the sterile field with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she'd done this before, in places where before meant years of training with Special Forces Combat Medical Corps. She obtained a 14-gauge needle, positioned herself at the anterior intercostal space on the left side, and without waiting for permission, without announcing her intentions, she performed what was technically an invasive procedure that was absolutely outside the scope of nursing practice in any civilian hospital in the United States. She drained the pressure from the pseudoaneurysm. The hiss of air escaping as fluid decompressed. The immediate change in his breathing patterns, the way his oxygen saturation climbed almost instantly, 93%, 95%, climbing toward normal. The way his face changed, the tension leaving his features as the pressure that had been slowly suffocating him released. It was a field procedure. A combat procedure. The kind of thing you did when you were hours from a surgical facility and someone was going to die otherwise. The kind of thing that worked because it addressed the immediate threat while you figured out the long-term solution. The kind of thing that was absolutely, completely, utterly unauthorized in a civilian hospital setting. Dr. Hargrove's eyes moved slowly toward her. His jaw tightened. And then, in front of Sarah, in front of the nursing staff, in front of the floor technician and the respiratory therapist and the anesthesiologist who'd arrived to prep for surgery, he began to speak. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" His voice was quiet, which made it worse. Quiet voices delivered consequences in ways shouting never could. You just performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. You just exceeded your scope of practice by about 1,000 miles. He stopped. Looked at her hands, still steady. Looked at the patient, whose oxygen saturation was now at 97%, whose breathing had eased into something approaching normal. Looked at the drain she'd placed, which was now collecting the pressure that had been compressing his lungs. And in that moment, his face shifted into something like calculation. Like a man who'd just realized that something didn't add up in the narrative he'd been telling himself about who this nurse was. "Get away from this patient," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "And we're going to have a conversation about exactly what just happened here. You might want to start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself." He turned away, his shoulders rigid with the particular kind of anger that came from being challenged by someone who was supposed to be invisible. The older medic in the doorway had gone completely pale. Sarah was staring at Brooke like she'd just watched her daughter do something impossible. And Brooke Sullivan, who had spent 2 years being invisible at Sacred Heart Hospital, who had practiced the art of being unremarkable and deferential and safely beneath notice, who had hidden everything that mattered about who she was beneath scrubs and a dying succulent and a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," turned and walked out of the procedure room with the kind of composure that only came from having already survived things that would have destroyed most people. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It shattered everything Dr. Hargrove thought he knew about the people he'd spent 2 years dismissing as beneath his attention. The red marker moved across the whiteboard with the precision of a surgical instrument. Dr. Hargrove's hand was steady, his smile sharper than any blade. "Sullivan, exceeding scope of practice, under review." The letters were large enough that nurses 2 stations over could read them without squinting. He stepped back, capped the marker with a soft click, and the whiteboard became a public execution notice. Brooke stood 15 feet away, pretending to review a patient chart, her eyes tracking the movement from peripheral vision. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing stayed level. But her hands that had held together a severed brachial artery with nothing but field sutures and muscle memory, those hands gripped the clipboard hard enough that her knuckles went white. He had walked into the patient's room while she was finishing the dressing change. The family was there, the veteran's daughter, her husband, 2 teenagers in hospital chairs who'd been watching Brooke work with the kind of attention usually reserved for surgeons in operating rooms. Dr. Hargrove had positioned himself at the foot of the bed like he owned the room, arms crossed, voice dripping condescension that sounded like honey poured over broken glass. "Miss Sullivan, are we playing doctor today?" His eyes had moved from the veteran to Brooke with theatrical slowness. "These experimental methods, where exactly did you train?" "YouTube?" The daughter's face had flushed. "Excuse me, this nurse just—" "I'm sure she did her best," Hargrove said, and that phrase, "I'm sure she did her best," carried the weight of 18 ways to call someone incompetent. These unauthorized techniques can feel impressive to the untrained eye. They're not based on protocol. They're not evidence-based. They're just risk. Brooke had taken one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in combat medic training when you're under fire and the next 3 seconds will determine if your patient lives or dies. She let one tear slide down her cheek, not a sob, not a break, just a single tear that reflected the overhead lights like evidence. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "I did what the patient needed when no one else would," she'd said quietly. Hargrove's jaw had tightened. The daughter had started to stand. The daughter's husband had put a hand on her arm. And Hargrove had pointed toward the door like he was ejecting a problem from his kingdom. "My office. Now." But the public humiliation, that was the whiteboard. That was the red marker. That was her name displayed like she was a cautionary tale for the other nurses to learn from. The room went dead silent when she walked past it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead, indifferent to the social destruction unfolding beneath them. Nurses gathered in clusters, whispering, their eyes cutting toward the board and away. The message was carved into the institutional consciousness. Dr. Hargrove didn't just have doubts about Brooke Sullivan. He had doubts in permanent marker. The break room the next afternoon was where the real damage happened. Brooke sat with her lunch, a turkey sandwich, apple, a container of yogurt she wouldn't finish, and the table emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm. Sarah grabbed her coffee mid-sip, abandoning a crossword puzzle she'd been working on. Marcus suddenly remembered a stack of charts that couldn't wait another second. Jennifer's phone rang at the exact moment Brooke made eye contact, and her expression shifted to apologetic as she left. Within 90 seconds, Brooke was alone at a table designed for 6. She didn't touch the sandwich. She stared at it instead, watching her reflection in the sealed plastic wrap, and then she packed it back into her lunch bag. By the third day, she'd stopped coming to the break room altogether. She ate in her car instead, windows rolled up, radio off, watching the parking lot with the kind of attention that came from years of scanning horizons for things that wanted you dead. The other nurses weren't trying to avoid her because they believed Hargrove. They were avoiding her because Hargrove had made avoiding her the safest choice. Hierarchy always protected itself. Loyalty to the institution outweighed loyalty to a person. Brooke understood this. She'd counted on it once, in Baghdad, and it had nearly killed her. The parking garage was concrete and shadows and the smell of diesel exhaust. Brooke was loading her bag into her locker when the older man appeared, the veteran's companion, the one who'd been observing from the doorway during the humiliation, the one whose presence had seemed to absorb every detail with military precision. He approached slowly, hands visible, the way you'd approach something wild that might bolt. "That suturing pattern," he said quietly. "I've only seen it once in my life. In a classified program. Taught to maybe 200 operators over 15 years. Brooke's face went white. Not from fear, from the sudden recognition that the single thing she'd spent 2 years burying, the identity she'd chosen to bury under scrubs and anonymity and the deliberate anonymity of Houston, had just surfaced like a body in rising water. "You're mistaken," she said. "Senior Chief." His voice carried a note of something, recognition, respect, question. That suturing pattern, nobody learns that unless. But Brooke had already turned away. She moved toward the stairwell with the kind of controlled precision that came from muscle memory, from 1,000 tactical exits across 2 decades. She didn't run. Running suggested panic. She walked with purpose, with the flat effect of someone executing a decision made long ago. He called after her, but she didn't turn around, didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge the possibility that someone had finally seen her. The manila folder on Dr. Hargrove's desk was thick, maybe an inch thick, pages organized with a kind of obsessive care that suggested he'd been building this case in his mind long before he'd built it in documentation. 2 board members sat in leather chairs across from him, their expressions neutral. One of them had a pen poised over a legal pad like a weapon. "Multiple policy violations, Ms. Sullivan," Hargrove said, and he spread the pages out like evidence at a crime scene. "Care to explain why you think the rules don't apply to you? Or should I call Florence Nightingale here?" He smiled. The smile had teeth in it. "What's your defense?" Brooke sat in the chair opposite, her posture upright but not aggressive, her hands folded but not submissive. Just balanced. Just present. The kind of presence that came from having survived worse than a hospital administrator with a folder full of paperwork. She looked at each board member in turn, made eye contact, and then back at Hargrove. "No defense," she said. The room shifted. Hargrove's hand paused over the pages. One of the board members stopped writing. "I followed protocol," Brooke continued, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "The patient was in acute distress. The responsible physician was unavailable. I stabilized the situation using accepted emergency medical practices. Everything in that folder is accurate. Everything. And I'd make the same decision again." Hargrove's jaw tightened. He leaned forward. "That's not how this institution operates." "I'm aware," Brooke said. "You could have cost us millions in liability. The patient is alive. The patient could sue us for this unauthorized. The patient's family is asking if you're available to do his follow-up care," one of the board members said quietly. She was looking at something in her own papers. They've specifically requested that Ms. Sullivan remain on his team. They've written a commendation. They're considering a donation to the hospital foundation. Hargrove's face darkened. He pushed back from his desk and stood, a gesture designed to reclaim power through height. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Effective immediately. But that wasn't what ended the meeting. What ended it was the sound of his office door opening, a security officer in the threshold, a phone in his hand, and behind him the sound of sirens. Not 1. 3. Maybe 4. Growing closer. Growing louder. Overlapping with something else, something that made the windows rattle in their frames. The sound of helicopter rotors, maybe 3 blocks away and getting closer. Hargrove's face went pale. Dr. Hargrove. The security officer's voice had changed. There are federal agents requesting access to the hospital. They're asking for Nurse Sullivan. And sir, they're asking for you as well. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, heavy rain that had started while they were inside, hammering the windows like applause. Brooke stood slowly, hands still visible, composure still intact. She looked at Dr. Hargrove, watched his mouth open and close without sound, watched the whiteboard's accusation, Sullivan, exceeding scope of practice, suddenly seem like the smallest thing in a room that was about to become very much larger. And then the sirens cut out. The sirens cut out. 3 seconds of silence. Then the intercom crackled to life, a code that made the charge nurse's spine stiffen, code blue, trauma bay 4. Repeat, code blue. It was 3:53 a.m. 72 hours since Dr. Hargrove had written her up on the unit board. 72 hours of nurses finding reasons to leave break rooms when Brooke entered, of her badge access restricted to supply closets and medication stations, of the systematic erasure of a person who'd been visible 48 hours before. She'd worked the night shift deliberately, fewer eyes, fewer judgments, fewer chances to encounter Hargrove's carefully constructed narrative about her recklessness. What she didn't anticipate was that the mute veteran, the one whose artery she'd sutured with her hand steady as surgical lasers, was about to code on her watch. She moved before thinking. Muscle memory took over. The trauma team converged on Trauma Bay 4, the senior resident Dr. Chen arriving first, pulling the patient's chart while a nurse began chest compressions. The veteran's oxygen saturation was already dropping, 94, 91, 88. His chest wall was asymmetric. The left side barely moved when the ventilator pushed air. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his heart. Every second his pressure climbed higher, his cardiac output sank lower. 45 seconds before cardiac arrest at this rate. Dr. Chen stood frozen. Not panic frozen. Something worse. The clinical paralysis of someone trained in protocol who'd never handled the deviation from it. His hands hovered above the patient's chest as if they might burn if he touched him without permission, without committee approval, without the safety net of a written procedure he could cite afterward. The resident opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. Brooke didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for eye contact from Chen. She moved to the veteran's left side, her fingers locating the anatomical landmarks with the precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorms under Taliban gunfire. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She swabbed the site with antiseptic, the sharp sting of iodine in the air, and the needle was already in her hand. 14 gauge. The size that allows pressurized air to escape fast enough to save a life instead of slow enough to let a man die while waiting for bureaucracy. The needle went in. Controlled. Deliberate. The angle perfect. The hiss came immediately. The sound of a compressed lung finally releasing pressure. O2 saturation 88, climbing. 91, 94. The patient's color shifted from dusky to pink. The monitor showed sinus rhythm returning, heart rate stabilizing around 112. Chest compressions continued, but they were working now. The lungs were inflating. The heart could pump blood to the brain again. 90 seconds. That was all it took. Dr. Chen's face had gone the color of old antiseptic. His eyes locked on Brooke's hands, which were already setting up a chest tube to keep the air pressure managed while they wheeled the veteran to the OR. She didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge him. The procedure was the only thing that existed. The patient was the only thing that mattered. Everything else, protocol, hierarchy, the unraveling of her career, fell away into the same compartment where she'd locked away Baghdad, the faces she couldn't save, the moral calculus of choosing which wounded combatant got resources and which got left behind. The chest tube was placed. The veteran was stable. They called for transport to the operating room and Brooke stepped back, her gloved hands coming away clean. She disposed of the needle in the sharps container with the same calm she'd shown while performing the procedure. Only then did she look up at the clock. 3:48 a.m. 1 minute had passed since the code started. She didn't anticipate what happened next. Not the appearance of Dr. Hargrove at 4:23 a.m., already dressed in slacks and an expensive shirt that probably cost more than Brooke's entire uniform. Not the way he walked through the ER with his tablet already open to the security footage, the angle capturing every angle of her needle placement, every centimeter of that procedure. Not the hospital administrator trailing behind him like a satellite caught in an orbit it never wanted. Hargrove's eyes were bright. Not with gratitude. With something else. Something that looked like opportunity. "Miss Sullivan," he said. The inflection made her name sound like an accusation. "My office." "Now." She followed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like insects, a sound that made her teeth ache. The hallway was empty. 4:38 a.m., the skeleton crew reduced to necessary personnel only. Her badge access had been revoked to the administrative corridor, but Hargrove unlocked the door to his office manually. The administrator, whose name was Vasquez, took a position by the door as if blocking an exit. As if Brooke might run. "Invasive procedure," Hargrove said, before she was even fully seated. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. "Without physician oversight. Without approval. Without documentation. You performed a needle decompression on a patient under Dr. Chen's care, contradicting his clinical judgment and creating a liability that Sacred Heart can no longer accept." Brooke didn't move. Didn't defend. The composure she'd built in 2 years in the oncology ward, the one she'd perfected across 12 years before that, settled over her like body armor. She met his eyes and said nothing. "The patient coded," Vasquez offered, as if this might require explanation. He needed immediate intervention. The patient needed a physician's decision, Hargrove said. His mouth had that tightness it got when he was performing certainty for an audience. "That's not Ms. Sullivan's decision to make. She's a registered nurse. She has scope of practice boundaries for a reason." Brooke's hands rested on the arms of the chair. Steady. The trembling that might have come to someone else, fear, anger, desperation, stayed locked where she kept it. The resident was frozen. The patient's oxygen saturation was 85. The collapsed lung was compressing the heart. "That's for a physician to assess," Hargrove said. He tapped the tablet. The security footage played silently, her hands moving, the needle going in, the procedural precision that took 90 seconds. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. Hospital policy violation number 47, exceeding scope of practice. I've already contacted hospital legal. You'll be receiving formal documentation by end of business today." The administrator nodded. Hargrove was already on his phone before she stood up. "Yes, I need the board chairman." "Tell him it's urgent," Hargrove said into the receiver. His voice shifted, warmer now, collaborative. "We have a nurse here with a documented pattern of recklessness. I need to flag it before she creates a liability we can't control." A pause. Then, "No, I saved the footage. Yes, I have the previous incident documented. I'm thinking we loop in her references from nursing school. Get ahead of this." Brooke's badge was deactivated by 5 a.m. She was escorted from the building, not roughly, nothing so obvious, but escorted nonetheless. The security guard was polite. Almost apologetic. He didn't make eye contact. Nobody did. The parking lot was empty. Her car sat under the buzzing sodium lights like an animal waiting to be claimed. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel and didn't start the engine. Through the windshield, she could see the entrance to Sacred Heart. The revolving glass doors where she'd walked in for 2 years, slowly building a new identity. A nurse. Just a nurse. Someone with a clean slate and no past and no ghosts waiting in Baghdad. Her phone rang. Her sister. The third call since Hargrove started his calls. Brooke let it ring. She couldn't tell her sister where she'd gone, not really. Couldn't explain the 2 years of anonymity, the deliberate choice to disappear into a hospital full of people who would never know what the faded unit patch hidden in her jacket lining actually represented. If she answered the phone now, she'd have to start explaining things. She'd have to tell someone about Hargrove, about the suspension, about the fact that she was now the woman who'd stepped outside her scope of practice to save a life, which somehow made her the criminal instead of the hero. The call went to voicemail. It was 5:02 a.m. In 12 minutes, the day shift would arrive. In 2 hours, Hargrove would call her nursing school and begin the systematic dismantling of her credibility. By noon, the recommendation for termination would be in motion. Sacred Heart had insurance. Hargrove had connections. Brooke had composure and a medical license that suddenly felt like a target. She finally started the car and drove home through Houston streets that were still dark, still sleeping, still unaware that somewhere in a secure wing, the mute veteran was being prepped for surgery with a chest tube Brooke had placed in 90 seconds of perfect, unauthorized clarity. They would save his life now. They would thank the resident when it was over. They would never know it was her hands that had kept the minutes from ticking past his viability. The rain started around 6 a.m. Not a storm. Just rain. The kind that sounds like forgetting when you're sitting in a parking lot listening to a phone that never stops ringing. Dr. Hargrove's hands trembled as he held his office phone, the kind of trembling that comes from knowing you've just made the best decision of your career. He'd waited until 9 p.m. to call the hospital board chairman at home, knowing the man would be 3 scotches into his evening and therefore more receptive to a conversation about protecting Sacred Heart's institutional reputation. The chairman answered on the second ring, voice warm with alcohol and authority. Hargrove laid it out with surgical precision, a nurse who'd exceeded her scope of practice twice in 72 hours, whose judgment was demonstrably compromised, whose presence now represented a liability that could cost them accreditation. The chairman had laughed, actually laughed, and said something about how it was refreshing to work with administrators who understood the importance of decisive action. By the time Hargrove hung up, the termination had been decided in the space between 2 sips of 16-year-old Macallan. That conversation lasted for minutes. It took 48 hours longer for Hargrove to activate the second phase of his plan, the one that would bury Brooke beneath an avalanche of documented patterns instead of a single incident. He'd spent Thursday evening on the phone with the director of nursing at the University of Texas Medical School, the place Brooke had graduated from 7 years prior. Hargrove had a gift for framing uncomfortable truths as professional concerns. He wasn't trying to damage her, he was simply attempting to understand a pattern. Had they noticed anything during her clinical rotations? Any incidents? Any flags? The director, bound by professional courtesy and not wanting to seem like she was harboring unreliable graduates, admitted that yes, there had been something, a student who worked too quickly, who seemed to anticipate problems rather than follow protocol, who'd actually corrected a resident surgeon during a procedure. Just a student being overconfident, probably. Nothing serious at the time. Hargrove had thanked her warmly and made a mental note to send flowers with a handwritten card. In the business of destroying careers, goodwill was currency. By Friday morning, he'd made 3 more calls. The chief nursing officer at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, where Brooke had completed a trauma rotation. The program director at Memorial Hermann, where she'd done her preceptorship. Each conversation was carefully calibrated, not an accusation, just questions. Pattern recognition. Professional concerns. Had she seemed like the type who might cut corners? Who might rely too heavily on instinct rather than protocol? By the time Hargrove finished his morning coffee, he'd constructed a narrative that existed nowhere in reality but lived everywhere in the minds of people who'd only heard his version of the story. A nurse with a pattern of recklessness. A nurse who'd always been too confident in her own judgment. A nurse whose impulses had finally caught up with her. The outside consultant arrived at Sacred Heart at 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon, a woman named Dr. Patricia Mendez who specialized in healthcare risk management and who'd built her reputation on finding institutional liabilities. Hargrove had strategically selected her because she was thorough, because she was efficient, and because she had no reason to doubt the narrative he'd carefully constructed across those 4 phone calls. He handed her the documentation, the incident report on the suturing, the suspension letter, the verbal accounts from the nurses who'd suddenly remembered vague concerns about Brooke's judgment. He also handed her copies of the 3 phone calls' contents, all meticulously transcribed by his secretary. Dr. Mendez spent 90 minutes reviewing the file in a conference room while Hargrove sat across from her, silent and professional. Her expression never changed. When she looked up, her recommendation was already written in her eyes: termination for cause, immediate and without severance, with documentation sufficient to defend against any wrongful termination claim. The pattern is clear, Dr. Mendez had said, her voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic certainty that sounded like truth. Multiple sources reporting similar concerns. Escalating behavior. A clear disregard for institutional hierarchy and established protocols. This isn't one incident. This is a professional pattern that's finally reached a critical threshold. Hargrove had nodded solemnly, as if he was disappointed rather than triumphant. By 3:51 p.m., the termination email was drafted, reviewed, and scheduled for delivery at 5 p.m., the exact time when most people were winding down their shifts, when the news would hit hardest, when Brooke would have to face the reality that her career at Sacred Heart had just been incinerated. The email was 3 paragraphs long and contained no emotion, just the precise language of institutional protection, effective immediately, for cause, final paycheck within 7 business days, return all hospital property. It was the kind of email that made you disappear. Brooke was sitting on the edge of her bed when the email arrived, still wearing yesterday's scrubs because changing clothes felt like admitting that today was going to be different than yesterday. She'd been staring at her hands for 2 hours, watching them tremor slightly, though not from fear, never from fear, but from the particular exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together with nothing but discipline and a 2-year-old lie. The laptop pinged. She didn't want to look. She looked anyway. By 4:15 p.m., Brooke had showered, changed into jeans and a faded Houston Astros sweatshirt, and started pulling items from her locker at Sacred Heart. The hospital seemed different when you were walking through it as a former employee, the same fluorescent lights, the same mint green walls, the same smell of antiseptic and human suffering, but all of it felt like it was happening behind glass. She'd worked here for 2 years. She'd saved lives here. She'd buried her identity here like a dog burying a bone, hoping no one would dig it up, hoping she could just be Brooke Sullivan, nurse, forever. The cardboard box was heavier than it should have been. She'd accumulated almost nothing in 2 years, a consequence of trying not to exist, but what she had mattered. The cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading white letters, a gift from a patient's daughter 4 months ago. A dying succulent that she'd kept alive through sheer stubbornness, its leaves yellowing at the edges, tilting sideways because the ceramic pot was slightly cracked. A photograph, the only one she'd kept from her service, 7 people in desert camouflage, squinting into a sun that seemed to rise over a place where mercy and warfare collided, and in the middle, slightly out of focus, was Marcus. Not Petty Officer Marcus Chen. Just Marcus. The medic who hadn't made it home. The one who'd bled out in her arms while she held pressure on a wound that had no right to survive because the IED had taken too much of him. Rain started as she left the break room. Not a gentle rain, but the kind that comes from a Texas sky ready to remind you how small you are. Brooke balanced the cardboard box on her hip, her other arm wrapped around it like it contained something that could break. She took the long way out, the way that would pass Dr. Hargrove's office. He was waiting by the employee exit, his expression arranged in the kind of concern that actually meant satisfaction. Two security guards stood behind him like apostles, and Brooke understood immediately what this was, not just a firing, but a display. A public reminder of what happens when you exceed your authority. "Ms. Sullivan." "Your badge," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with the manufactured regret of someone who'd never actually felt anything in his life. Brooke unclipped her badge, the same badge that had admitted her to trauma bays and intensive care units, the same badge that had let her save lives in the shadows, and placed it in his outstretched hand. Their eyes met for 2 seconds. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. "Thank you, Dr. Hargrove, for the opportunity." She said it the way soldiers say goodbye when they're about to walk into a place they know they won't return from. Then she turned and walked toward the emergency department exit, the rain already beginning to soak through her sweatshirt, and Dr. Hargrove stood holding her hospital badge like it was a trophy, already imagining how he'd framed this moment to the board chairman during their next conversation. Another problem solved. Another threat eliminated. Another day where his authority remained absolute and unquestioned. The bus stop shelter had a crack in its plexiglass window, and through it, Houston looked like a city painted in watercolor. Brooke stood with a cardboard box balanced on her hip, watching rain bead on the surface, creating patterns that looked almost like a message in some language she'd never learned. Inside the box, the dying succulent leaned further sideways, as if even it was surrendering. The cracked mug caught the light at a strange angle. And beneath them both, the photograph of Marcus seemed to absorb the darkness rather than reflect it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing nobody understood about people who'd been trained to function in chaos. Steady hands weren't a sign of confidence. They were a sign of having already accepted loss. 2 years ago, she'd walked into Sacred Heart as Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, trying to become Brooke Sullivan, nurse, and for almost 700 days she'd managed the impossible. She'd buried herself so completely that no one thought to look. She'd let herself be called careless when she was methodical. Reckless when she was trained. Just another nurse when she carried the weight of 18 lives saved under fire and 3 cross-border rescues locked inside her rib cage like a second heartbeat. The rain hammered the shelter like 1,000 hands demanding to know who she really was. In the distorted reflection of the plexiglass, she could see her own face, the same face that had kept a man's artery sealed together with muscle memory and prayer. The same face that had made a SEAL commander cry without saying a word. The same face that had learned how to live in a world where the smallest mistakes meant funerals with flags folded into triangles. She reached down and straightened the succulent in its box, touching the yellowed leaves with the precision of someone handling something sacred. At the Federal Operations Center in downtown Houston, 3 hours away, men and women in suits were reviewing files that had been classified for longer than Brooke Sullivan had been alive. The veteran in the secure wing at Sacred Heart, the mute man whose life she'd saved, had been cross-referenced with biometric databases and identified within 40 minutes. Name, Karim al-Rabia. Former resistance fighter. Captured during Operation Enduring Freedom. Released under mysterious circumstances in 2016 after emergency medical intervention. The circumstances were no longer mysterious. The medical intervention was suddenly very, very real. And the woman who'd performed that intervention, against every protocol and in direct violation of military law and the laws of armed conflict, had just been terminated for cause by her civilian employer. Dr. Hargrove was already 2 glasses into his celebration, sitting in the board chairman's office on the hospital's executive level, both men congratulating each other on handling the situation with such decisiveness. Hargrove had already drafted a press release about protecting patient safety through institutional accountability. The chairman was already thinking about how this would look in the hospital's quarterly report to stakeholders: decisive leadership, clear protocols, strong institutional values. Neither of them noticed the 3 SUVs with federal license plates pulling into Sacred Heart's parking lot. Neither of them heard the radio traffic that was already beginning to crisscross Houston's airspace. At the bus stop, rain beading on the cardboard box balanced on a woman's hip, the phone that had been silent for 2 years suddenly rang. Not her personal phone, she barely used that anymore. The phone that was hidden in a compartment inside her jacket lining, the one with no name in the directory. The phone that only rang when ghosts decided to come home. Brooke answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask who was calling. She already knew. Senior Chief Sullivan, the voice on the other end, said, "We need you." 3 days. That's how long it had taken for her past to catch up with her. 3 days from the moment she'd exposed her hands to the moment she had to choose whether to be Brooke Sullivan, the nurse they'd just fired, or Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, the medic who'd defied orders because the only law higher than military code is the law of human decency. 3 days. That's how long it had taken for federal agents to find her at the bus stop on Bellaria Boulevard, rain drumming against the hood of an unmarked sedan, her cardboard box of possessions sitting like a coffin on the back seat. They didn't say who had called them. They didn't say how they knew where she'd be. They just handed her a phone, a military-grade encrypted line, something from another life, and on the other end, a voice that sounded like gravel running over concrete, "We need you at Sacred Heart. Today." The drive back to the hospital took 14 minutes. Brooke sat in the back seat watching Houston slide past the rain-streaked windows, her jacket draped over her shoulders, the faded Special Forces unit patch still sewn inside the lining like a secret written in thread. She had worn this jacket for 2 years without anyone knowing what it meant. Without anyone knowing she was wearing her military rank against her ribs, pressed against her sternum, a heartbeat away from discovery. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The woman they'd fired and humiliated would walk back through those doors, and by the time she left again, everything would be different. Sacred Heart's lobby erupted the moment she entered. A decorated SEAL team leader stood near the main desk, ribbons on his chest like a history of combat, Command Master Chief insignia gleaming on his collar, flanked by military brass and FBI agents whose suits hung with the weight of federal authority. Camera crews waited by the entrance. News vans crowded the circular drive. The hospital had transformed into a stage, and Brooke was the actor who'd been written out of the script entirely. The administrative boardroom filled as word spread through the building. Nurses who'd abandoned her stood along the walls, whispering, their faces flushed with the realization that they'd chosen the wrong side. Dr. Hargrove stood near the corner, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might fracture. The older medic, the companion who'd watched her suturing technique and recognized something classified, now wore the insignia of a lieutenant commander, his eyes fixed on Brooke with the intensity of a man who'd been searching for her for 18 months. The veteran was in the secure wing, but his daughter entered the boardroom first, a woman in her 40s with her father's dark eyes, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. "You saved my father twice," she said, and the room contracted into absolute silence. Once in Baghdad when he was the enemy. And once 3 days ago when he was a patient. Her hand shook as she held up her phone. He's not mute anymore. Therapy. Time. And the woman who treated him like he was worth saving. She looked directly at Brooke. "He asked me to say it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. Welcome home." The room didn't just go silent. The room forgot how to breathe. The SEAL commander stepped forward, a classified file folder in his hands, the red stamp on the cover visible even from 10 feet away. He opened it with deliberate precision, his voice carrying through the boardroom and out through the cameras broadcasting live to the city of Houston. "Bronze Star with Valor." The words landed like a statement of fact. Reaction rippled through the staff, heads turning toward Brooke, seeing her differently now, recalibrating everything they thought they knew. "Navy Cross," the commander continued, each medal its own sentence, its own proof. "Purple Heart." Then a longer pause, the kind of silence that precedes a declaration. "Navy Cross." The second one. The citation listed 18 lives saved under fire. 3 cross-border rescue operations conducted under rules of engagement so classified that even the names of the locations couldn't be spoken in civilian spaces. Brooke's hands were steady. Her face was a mask. But inside her chest, something vast and heavy was finally putting down its burden. An FBI liaison stepped to the podium. He's bearing that particular kind of federal authority that came from knowing classified information that the audience would never be cleared for. The operation Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan participated in was classified until yesterday, he stated, and head swiveled toward Hargrove like a single organism. It has now been declassified and vindicated by international courts. The mercy operation she conducted, against orders, at personal risk, has been officially recognized as justified. All charges, all questions, all controversy surrounding that decision have been formally absolved. He paused, and the weight of those words settled onto the room like gravity. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan is not a subject of inquiry. She's a subject of commendation. That's when it happened. That's when Dr. Hargrove stopped being competent and started being desperate. A senior military authority, a full admiral whose name would later appear on federal documents, turned to face Hargrove directly. The camera swung toward him. Every lens focused. Every microphone caught every syllable. "You suspended a decorated warrior for saving a life," the admiral said, his voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to command, to being obeyed without question. "You weaponized hospital policy against a woman with more courage in her fingernail than you'll accumulate in your entire career." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was already dying around Hargrove. "You attempted to destroy her reputation to protect your ego. And you're about to experience the consequences." The hospital CEO stepped forward, clipboard in hand, her face arranged in the kind of professional grim that preceded execution. "Dr. Marcus Hargrove," she said, reading from the termination letter with the careful enunciation of someone documenting history, "your contract with Sacred Heart is terminated effective immediately for breach of fiduciary duty, abuse of authority, and obstruction of a federal witness under protective status." She handed the letter to a security officer. Then she looked directly at him. "You're escorted out. Now." Hargrove's face burned crimson. Not the pink of embarrassment. The violent red of a man whose entire world was collapsing in real time, broadcast live, immortalized in 1,000 camera feeds and social media posts. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "This is a misunderstanding," he managed, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. "I was protecting the hospital. I was protecting, but there was no one left to protect him." The board members he'd mentored looked away. The administrative staff he'd intimidated suddenly discovered urgent tasks elsewhere. Jennifer from the night shift was filming on her phone. Marcus was slow clapping, the sound carrying like mockery through the boardroom. Sarah mouthed something that looked like Florence Nightingale, and she smiled. An FBI agent stepped forward as Hargrove tried to gather his documents, his briefcase, his dignity, all of which were spilling onto the tile floor like his career. "We'll be reviewing your handling of a federal witness under protection," the agent stated flatly. "Obstruction of justice charges are being considered. You'll be contacted regarding your testimony." Hargrove's hands shook. Actually trembled. His eyes darted around the room searching for an ally, a sympathizer, someone who would defend him. The room had decided otherwise. Security moved toward him with a quiet certainty of institutional force, and as they escorted him out, past the very unit board where he'd written Brooke's name in red, someone had already erased it. In its place, in fresh red marker, Dr. Marcus Hargrove, terminated for cause. The lieutenant commander approached Brooke as the boardroom erupted into controlled chaos, reporters speaking frantically into phones, staff members calling family members, the video already spreading across social media with captions and trending hashtags. His bearing was military precision wrapped in a human body. "We've been looking for you for 18 months, he said quietly, only for her ears. "You disappeared. Went dark. No contact. No forwarding address." His eyes studied her face as if reading text that only a fellow warrior could translate. "We thought the worst." Brooke's hands stopped trembling. Her voice dropped an octave, the mask falling away to reveal what had always been underneath. "I had to die to stay alive," she said. And the lieutenant commander nodded, because he understood that equation in his bones. He understood that sometimes the only way to save yourself from the war is to let everyone believe the war has already taken you. "Welcome back, Senior Chief," he said. 6 months passed like a held breath exhaled. Brooke stood in her Navy dress uniform at the White House, the faded Special Forces unit patch now displayed properly on her shoulder with the insignia that proved everything she'd been hiding. The ribbons on her chest, bronze star with Valor, Navy Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, reflected the camera flashes with the weight of truth finally allowed to exist in sunlight. The president's hand was warm as it pressed the Presidential Citizen's Medal into her palm, and the citation was read aloud with the formality of state ceremony, for extraordinary service under fire and continued heroism in civilian life. This nation honors Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. The mute veteran sat in the front row, no longer mute, his voice healed through 9 months of therapy and the knowledge that someone had valued his life enough to break every rule. His daughter sat beside him, enrolled in nursing school, telling everyone who would listen about the woman who saved her father twice, once from the war, once from the hospital system. Tears ran down their faces, but these were not the tears of trauma. These were the tears of recognition. Of home. That night, in an apartment that finally felt like a place rather than a hiding spot, Brooke unpacked the cardboard box that had carried her entire dismissed life. The dying succulent had been replaced with a thriving plant, leaves unfurled, green as hope. The cracked mug read "World's Most Decorated Nurse" in fresh letters. And the faded unit patch, the one that had lived sewn inside her jacket lining for 2 years, a heartbeat against her sternum, finally emerged into air. She held it with the reverence normally reserved for sacred objects. Pressed it flat against her heart. Looked at her reflection in the mirror, the woman who no longer needed to hide, who no longer needed to run, who had finally arrived at the destination she'd abandoned 2 years ago. The photograph of her unit medic, the one who hadn't made it home, sat on her new desk at the VA hospital where she now directed trauma services, the gold bars of her commissioned rank finally visible to everyone. She'd told his family the story yesterday. They cried. They said his name would finally mean something again because she had lived, because she had refused to disappear. Sacred Heart had changed the wall in its oncology ward within a month. Photographs of veteran staff members, their ranks and decorations listed beneath their names. Brooke's face was prominent: Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, Trauma Services, Medal of Commendation. The unit board that had carried her humiliation now carried her vindication. And every Tuesday she trained new combat medics at a private clinic, her hand steady as concrete, her voice calm as a field medic who'd seen the worst and emerged with the deepest kindness. She taught them the field suturing technique that had gotten her fired. She showed them how to make life-or-death decisions when the rulebook didn't matter anymore. She proved, every single day, that the quietest person in the room could be the one holding everything together. Dr. Hargrove taught CPR compressions at a community college in a strip mall. $15 an hour. No prestige. No power. No one looking up at him anymore. His medical license was under indefinite review. His name had become a cautionary tale told in hospital corridors. His board connections had severed faster than a hot scalpel through skin. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, if you believe that the quietest warriors deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Your stories matter. Keep watching, keep believing, keep sharing.